This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans, it's time for another episode of Wrestling's Greatest Moments. Wrestlers can go from rags to riches back to rags, with fans left asking, what happened? Sit back as Wrestling's Greatest Moments looks at some of the most well-known wrestlers of the 80s and tries to make sense of how their work went from the Penthouse to the Outhouse in the 90s. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. There's nothing quite as sad as watching a wrestler go from an entertaining star to a shell of their former selves. There are several common reasons this can happen, including a wrestler's personal demons, Father Time catching up with them, or a wrestler simply no longer caring and just plain phoning it in. Junkyard Dog. Was the Junkyard Dog a trained, accomplished Greco-Roman wrestler known for having 5-star matches? Not hardly, but the reality is that professional wrestling has long incorporated a mixture of all styles of in-ring performances, including pure straight-up brawling. In the Dog's case, he took his unique brand of powerful brawling and coupled it with a sincere and infectious likability from the fans, which led him to being a much-loved babyface despite his lack of any real technical in-ring skills. This led to promoter Bill Watts covering up his lack of grappling skills by having him work short, explosive matches. Of course, the Junkyard Dog's real selling points were his charisma and his gift of gab. It seemed the fans just couldn't get enough of their beloved JYD. Bill Watts knew how to take these qualities and book him against the right opponents, transforming the Junkyard Dog into one of wrestling's greatest stars of the 1980s. Vince McMahon, ever the opportunist, saw just how big of a draw the Junkyard Dog was, and he knew JYD could be a huge draw for the WWF. At this time, Vince had developed quite a reputation for disregarding territorial borders, along with the long-held understanding that poaching talent from another promoter was off limits. Regardless of this unwritten rule, it wasn't long before Vince was able to lure JYD away from Bill Watts with a better offer, just as he had done with other talent from other promoters. Junkyard Dog was one of the top WWF stars of the 1980s that had fans jumping out of their seats to get a look at their hero, and folks at home tuned in whenever possible just to get a glimpse of him on any of the WWF's televised shows. Sadly, by the 1990s, personal demons took their toll on the Dog so badly that he was largely living off of his reputation, and his in-ring performances reflected that. Sometimes, however, that's good enough for promoters, and in the case of WCW, the Dog fit the bill. Unfortunately for fans who'd watched JYD in his heyday, it was like watching their once lively puppy reduced to a tired old mutt. Jim Duggan. Like the Junkyard Dog, working in the WWF allowed Hacksaw to put his in-ring performance into cruise control. He certainly wasn't alone, as most wrestlers slowed their pace down tremendously to accommodate the WWF style of sports entertainment over wrestling. Unfortunately, the WWF's resident patriot Jim Duggan toned things down more than a bit, becoming a caricature of himself. Unfortunately, his run in WCW took things to an even lower level of performance, leaving many fans wondering why he was even employed. As the authors of The Death of WCW suggest, with television and pay-per-view success, Hogan was able to convince Bischoff that he held the key that would take WCW to the top of the mountain: his friends, all of whom coincidentally needed big paydays. So Randy Savage, Jim Duggan, Earthquake John Tenta, Honky Tonk Man, Jimmy Hart, and countless others were brought into the fold. The downside for WCW fans was watching their beloved WCW stars replaced by one aging and unenthusiastic WWF star after another. In cases like Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, however, WCW fans were sincerely interested in seeing them. However, Duggan and many of his fellow WWF intruders took valuable time away from the WCW stars that fans actually tuned into the show wanting to see. Honky Tonk Man. Wayne Ferris was a wrestler whose Elvis Presley impersonator gimmick as Honky Tonk Wayne in Calgary Stampede Wrestling got him a gig in the WWF. Initially working as a babyface, the Honky Tonk Man's gimmick was too much for fans, and the WWF wisely turned him heel. Years before, Ferris had proved his worth in Memphis wrestling. The future Elvis impersonator had some epic matches in Memphis, including the legendary Tupelo Concession Brawl. Ferris's ability to generate magma-hot heat made him a strong draw, especially up north in Titanland. The WWF gave him a run with the Intercontinental Championship that initially appeared to be a transitional run. However, he had real heat with fans, and his ability to sell tickets led to the WWF keeping the belt on him for a record length. The Honky Tonk Man seemed to be a wrestler who needed a title to keep heat on him, though. In fact, he seemed to lose his momentum once he dropped the belt. Rumor has it that the WWF wanted to put the tag team titles on Honky Tonk and Greg Valentine. Check out our video, 4 80s tag teams that were supposed to win the tag team championship. Like many former WWF stars, the Honky Tonk Man jumped to WCW in the mid-90s. The greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time was friends with Jimmy Hart and Hulk Hogan, which helped him to gain access to WCW. However, Honky Tonk found the company wasn't exactly the land of milk and honey he'd been led to believe it was. While some wrestlers enjoyed significant contracts, Honky Tonk was reportedly only paid $1,000 per appearance. Wrestling legend has it that he butted heads with Eric Bischoff, and often, leading to ATM Eric canceling him faster than an Elvis stamp. This happened so much so that Bischoff actually discussed his joy in sending Honky Tonk Man packing. As Bischoff was heard in an interview with Lucha Libre Online, "It comes back to the only guy I've ever really enjoyed firing. I mean, it put a smile on my face. In this moment when you ask me that question, I'm getting goosebumps. I'm getting a smile from ear to ear because I had to fire the Honky Tonk Man. I would fire the Honky Tonk Man every single day of every single year for the rest of my life, and I would get just as much joy." Truth be told, stories like this invite discussion as to whether Eazy-E had reached a Caligula-like state of being drunk with power. Consider Bischoff's penchant for firing wrestlers via Federal Express, including Sean Waltman, aka X-Pac, and Steve Austin. The Austin case is noteworthy because Austin was reportedly at home recovering from a wrestling-related injury when he got his pink slip. Mike Shaw is more than a trivia question. He's an oft-overlooked wrestler whose heyday was clearly in the 80s when he worked in Calgary Stampede Wrestling as Makan Singh, a member of the heel faction Karachi Vice. The storyline was well known thanks to exposure in the After magazines. Regrettably, Shaw's heyday in Calgary was followed by one bad gimmick after another when he jumped to WCW. Things started off with the tasteless Norman the Lunatic character. Norman wasn't the first gimmick based off mental illness, but it was poorly executed and tone deaf. WCW followed up with Shaw playing the big rig driving trucker Norman, which was a step up from playing a lunatic, depending on who you ask. In a classic example of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, Norman jumped to the WWF. Just to show WCW nobody can outdo them in cartoon characters, the WWF outdid themselves with Shaw's WWF character. In 1993, the WWF introduced their fans to Friar Ferguson, an apparent combination of the Robin Hood character Friar Tuck and Porky Pig. Wrestling legend has it that the not-so-holy roller character reportedly angered the Catholic Church of New York, leading to his disappearance. However, it's difficult to imagine Vince McMahon fearing excommunication or any other religious wrath. After all, this is the same man who started his own religion, McMahonism, and at one point pitted himself in a match against God himself. However, the WWF may have been concerned about advertisers and took things even lower when it transformed the Friar into Bastion Booger, an even worse character for Shaw. Booger lived up to his name, showcasing every disgusting habit allowed on TV at the time. While Friar Ferguson only made one TV appearance, fans had to endure Bastion Booger for months. Sergeant Slaughter. For fans who have only seen Sergeant Slaughter during his Iraqi sympathizer days, it may be difficult to understand how he ever landed a role as WWF champion. However, if you've seen Slaughter's work from the 70s and 80s, you know he was one of the best brawlers of his era, as well as a fantastic talker. Whether he was playing a sadistic Marine Corps drill instructor turned wrestler or a tough-as-nails patriot, Slaughter knew how to work and talk fans into the arenas. His feuds against Pat Patterson and the Iron Sheik in the WWF were legendary, as was his tag team program along Don Kernodle against Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood. As Slaughter fans all know, a dispute with Vince McMahon led to him leaving the company when he was arguably the promotion's top babyface right behind Hulk Hogan. By the time Slaughter returned to the WWF in 1990, he was bloated and seemingly bereft of all wrestling skills. Slaughter threw out his arsenal, trading his legendary Cobra Clutch for, and I'm not making this up, an atomic noogie. The WWF's tasteless Iraqi sympathizer bit was bad enough, but the real disgrace was Slaughter's seeming inability to work. By 1991, Slaughter was phoning it in so badly he should have been the spokesman for MCI's long-distance services Friends and Family commercials. Undoubtedly, his matches against Hulk Hogan were so bad that he made the Hulkster look like Ric Flair by comparison. Brutus Beefcake. Brutus Beefcake is another wrestler whose contrast between his 1980s and 1990s wrestling was like night and day. The barber had the physique Vince McMahon craved, a surprising amount of charisma, and a workmanlike level of skill that was well suited for the 1980s WWF. He wasn't a mat technician, but he had the combination of wrestling fundamentals as well as the action-oriented style the WWF liked to feature, along with a merchandise-moving gimmick. Beefcake had some high-profile programs from the get-go, including a WWF Tag Team Championship run with Greg the Hammer Valentine, some serious singles feuds, and a main event tag team program along his BFF Hulk Hogan against Randy Savage and Zeus. Beefcake even bounced back from a horrific parasailing accident returning to the ring. Unfortunately, the real disaster was his time in WCW, where the promotion maneuvered through cease and desist letters aimed at keeping the well-known grappler, Ed Leslie, from using his Brutus the Barber character. As was common for mid-90s WCW, a complete absence of imagination led to terrible gimmicks, including the Booty Man, the Butcher, Zodiac, and the Disciple. Leslie matched creative's lack of effort with a complete lack of motivation, action, and enthusiasm in the ring. Ultimate Warrior. Wait, we know what you're saying. The Ultimate Warrior shouldn't be on our list as he has always been a train wreck in the ring. Anyone who has seen his early work in Memphis knows Jim Hellwig could walk or run into the ring, but that was about the extent of his in-ring technical abilities, never mind pulling off anything resembling an actual professional wrestling match. Nevertheless, by the time he got to the WWF, he was packaged in a way that played to his strengths and avoided his many, and we do mean many, weaknesses. That wasn't the case in the 1990s though, when he seemed to be in the ring for one reason: cashing a paycheck. His short-lived run in the WWF in 1996 and painful One Warrior Nation storyline in WCW in 1998 had fans wishing he'd stuck to running Warrior University. Roddy Piper. Rowdy Roddy Piper could talk anyone into a building. He will go down as one of the all-time greats to ever lace up a pair of wrestling boots and is an absolute legend in the world of professional wrestling. He could work incredible matches, combining fisticuffs, a smattering of technical wrestling, and heel hijinks to win matches. Piper usually entered a promotion as a heel, becoming the man fans loved to hate. Eventually, fans couldn't help but love Piper's joy for life, or as the French would say, his joie de vivre, and promoters would ultimately turn him babyface. When Vince McMahon went national, he had his top babyface in place, Hulk Hogan. However, he needed the perfect foil to go up against Hogan and wisely brought Piper in. Just as before, Piper won over fans, and the WWF would also eventually turn him babyface. When Hollywood called, Piper seemed to be gone, but he always seemed to find time for occasional runs in the WWF. By 1989, Piper was largely working as a color commentator. Surprisingly, Piper's babyface commentary was flat, unlike his time in Georgia Championship Wrestling when he worked as a heel color commentator. Piper occasionally wrestled, appearing in a role as a special attraction. With few exceptions, however, there was nothing special about his work in the ring at this point in his career. When he did wrestle, it was against familiar foes such as Ric Flair or rising stars such as Bret Hart, who helped hide Hot Rod's deterioration in the ring. By the 90s, the Hot Scott, like many 70s and 80s greats, had perfected the art of phoning it in, an especially useful talent during the Monday Night War when both the WWF and WCW were willing to throw money at greats from the past. Jake Roberts. Wrestling's greatest moments won't dwell on Jake Roberts' personal demons other than to say they were bad enough that they were featured in the documentary Beyond the Mat and the WWE DVD Pick Your Poison, the Jake the Snake Roberts story. This second-generation wrestler seemed bound for greatness and a lasting spot in the main event. A solid worker, Jake's use of the DDT took him out of the mid-card. However, Roberts' real strengths lied in his understanding of in-ring psychology and his promos. Indeed, Jake had the ability to mesmerize fans with his promos, much like his reptilian nickname. Unfortunately, substance abuse led to one bad decision after another as he left the WWF for WCW. Bad luck played a part there too, as a lucrative contract with WCW fell through and Roberts left the company. When the WWF was desperate enough to bring him back, Roberts was enjoying a period of sobriety. He was no longer booked as a top star and was used to put Steve Austin over at 1996's King of the Ring. After the match, Austin cut his now legendary Austin 316 promo, mocking the religious faith Roberts had touted since his comeback. A relapse sent Roberts spiraling downwards. As fans have seen many times, there was always someone willing to hire a wrestler with name value. This was evident at 1999's infamous Heroes of Wrestling show. There, Jake was clearly in no condition to perform. The promoter had to turn Jake's one-on-one match against Jim Neidhart into a tag match with a wobbly and woozy Roberts counting the lights while the ring likely seemed to spin around him. The good news is that Jake eventually succeeded in conquering his personal demons. This story is worth checking out in the documentary The Resurrection of Jake the Snake Roberts. Greg Valentine. Second-generation grappler Greg Valentine was renowned for his legitimate toughness, hard-hitting matches, and uncanny ability to enrage fans in the ring by punishing opponents and bragging about it during promos. Valentine enjoyed success in Jim Crockett Promotions and the WWF before he joined dozens of other stars in jumping to the WWF when Vince McMahon Jr. sought to take it national in 1983. Valentine let fans know why he was nicknamed the Hammer, brutalizing opponents during his 80s WWF tenure. His reign as Intercontinental Champion began with him hospitalizing previous champion Tito Santana and continued with him thwarting Santana's bid to regain the belt. Valentine showcased his tag team skills for fans in the WWF when he and newcomer Brutus Beefcake captured the WWF Tag Team Championship. While Valentine didn't slow down after dropping the tag titles, he seemed to grow frustrated with the WWF's increasingly cartoonish presentation of wrestling. By the 1990s, it was obvious Valentine wasn't happy to be working in the company, and he eventually left. The Hammer also seemed to lose a step thanks to Father Time. Simply put, Valentine had reached his sell-by expiration date, not so much in his physical conditioning, but in how the business had changed. The days of working 60-minute Broadways 7 nights a week were over. Valentine could no longer utilize the methodical pace that made his matches worth watching, and furthermore, the aging process made his stocky physique anything but intimidating next to an array of muscle heads. Do you agree with our list? Share your thoughts in the comments section and let us know if there are any videos you'd like Wrestling's Greatest Moments to cover. In the meantime, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and spread the good news about Wrestling's Greatest Moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.